Hello. Thanks so much for having me. Uh, my name is Phil, and over the pandemic, I learned how to code. A friend of mine, right when the things were starting to, flare up, a friend of mine was working on a mod for the video game Doom, so I learned how to code to help him out. I figured this would be kind of a fun way to learn how to code, get my hands on with a little more coding experience. But it turns out that making a Doom mod in 2021 is actually a lot more complicated than you might think. It was a little more than I bargained for. And I want to explain why that is by talking a little bit about the engine that powers the Doom games. So when you think about Doom, Doom is a game that came out in 1993. But what happened shortly after that is a couple other spin-offs and games that use the Doom engine begin to come out. They start adding their own features. They start adding all these new scripting systems, things that people can use. At the same time, fans are also making their own hacked version of Doom where they can add new graphics and effects. So you get things like, the Simpsons Doom mods that come out around that time. And then also the Doom source code is released publicly. So fans begin to take all of these features, all these spin-offs, and they begin to incorporate them into new versions of the Doom engine. And they keep adding features and making spin-offs. And they keep stacking things on top and keep stacking things on top over and over and over until you get this teetering tower of dependencies that is the Doom engine. Just all these features just stacked atop each other. So, if you made a Doom mod back in the day, you really just had to learn one or two things. If you're making a Doom mod in the year 2021, you have to learn a modified version of C that is based on a custom bespoke programming language that is built on top of a series of spin-offs and hacks to a video game from 1993. And there's also a completely separate scripting language you have to learn how to use that has a different version of math. So it's kind of a mess. And I want to walk through, I get the sense that a lot of coding is like this. So I want to walk through one example I had to deal with where I learned how temperamental this stuff can be. And this is an example of trying to play one sound effect and everything that rippled out of that decision. So this is a very silly Doom mod my friend was making. So there was a feature I wanted to add to the mod called constant screaming mode, where you turn it on and the player character just screams constantly. It's very silly, but I thought like, oh, this is a joke feature. I can, knock this out in like an hour. It'll be pretty easy to do. So this was the script I originally wrote. It's a pretty simple script for the player that says, if screaming mode is turned on, play the screaming sound effect. If screaming mode is turned off, don't play the screaming sound effect. But things got complicated pretty quickly because, again, of this giant tower of dependencies and other versions of Doom, and there's all these features that kind of conflict and collide and don't mesh well. So I want to talk about two of those features and how they ended up making this very simple script surprisingly complicated. So one of the things in this mod is, in addition to playing as the traditional human Doom character, there's also a part in the game where you turn into a tank. And we do this by using a feature that was introduced in one of the Doom spin-offs called the Morph System. This was added in the game Heretic, which was it uses the Doom engine. And it's a feature that lets one player character transform into another player character. It was originally used as sort of a joke. There was an item that turns you into a chicken in Heretic. So we're using it in ways it was really never intended to be used. And it doesn't play well with some of the other features that eventually got added to the Doom engine. And one of those big features is the way that gender is conceptualized in the Doom engine. This was something that was added by fans in 1998 in a fan version of the Doom engine called ZDoom. And it was meant to let players use custom pronouns in multiplayer mode. So, when you get blown up, it says player one killed herself, for instance. And I think this was, a fairly progressive feature for its time, but it has some pretty significant limitations. The biggest one is that the player's voice sound effects are tied directly to the gender they select, which is, somewhat an archaic understanding of how gender works, but it's what we have to work with when we're making a Doom mod. But the really weird part of this is that gender in the Doom engine is conceptualized as a scale of 0 to 3, which, sure. So here's the scale. The reason this is so weird is because players are the only characters in the game that actually get given genders based on the player's preferences. Everything else in the game gets a default gender value of 0, which, as you can see here, corresponds to male, which means that technically speaking, every object in the game that's not a player, we're talking every monster, every rocket launcher, every flaming barrel, is technically male. The reason this is a problem is because the morph system was designed before there was ever gender in the Doom engine. So it doesn't account for it. When you turn it into a tank, it's considered a new character that's not technically the player, so therefore the tank is also considered male, so it's not going to play the correct sound effects. So I had to manually re-implement the gender system of the Doom engine. I had to manually rewrite it and attempt to read the player's preference file and then see what, choose which sound effect to play based on that. So this is already starting to get pretty far out of hand. This script is getting pretty long for what was originally supposed to be a joke feature. But we're not done yet. Of course, there's one other very frustrating thing. So we have to go back again to the morph system, because once again, we're using it in ways it was never intended to be used. It was a way to make the player turn into a chicken as a joke. We're using it as like a major feature of this game. So the issue is that when you transform with the morph system, what I learned is that technically the player doesn't actually transform. The player becomes intangible and invisible. A new character appears, and then you control the new character. So technically, there's two characters in the game world at once now. There's the human character, and there's the tank character. And the Doom engine doesn't distinguish between them. So now both these characters are screaming at the same time. This is not ideal. So we have to find some way to only make the correct character scream. And we turn to something that I understand is a very important part of any programmer skill set, which is terrible workarounds. What we end up doing is we're going to use the inventory system in the Doom engine, because for some reason, the inventory system does work with the morph system. Things do transfer between characters correctly. So we're going to horribly misuse this. We're going to, instead of having the player scream themselves, we're going to give them an item that screams. The item, if it's owned by a player, it will look at the player's options, see what gender they selected, and then scream in the correct gender. But then when they turn into a tank, that item is going to transfer correctly. So it's still only going to be one scream sound effect. It's moving over to the correct character. This is how we have to implement this. This is kind of ridiculous. So again, I started out with like a 6-line script, and by the end of this process, I've ended up with a script that is multiple pages long and spans across multiple files. It has to re-implement a chunk of the Doom engine into it in order to work correctly. So like going into this project, I understood when people said like, "Oh, my code is so ugly. It's so, it's so full of hacks. Don't look at it." And I understood that in principle, but I don't think I actually was able to get what that meant until I did this, until I had to create this, terrible Frankenstein workaround to make this joke feature in the Doom engine work correctly. But it was a very interesting experience. I learned a lot about programming, having to see a very simple line of code slowly turn into this monstrosity. So the lessons I learned from this, the most important lesson was coding is a labyrinth of absurdities. I get the sense that a lot of coding is like this, that there's just these towers of dependencies and things you have to worry about affecting different levels and having to understand how the engine interprets what you've written. I get the sense that this is a lot of what coding is. But the thing is, I liked it. I really enjoyed this. I like the problem solving aspects of it. I like the fact that you get this seemingly simple task, and to actually make it work, you have to start to understand how the engine works. You have to understand how it's interpreting your inputs, how different parts of the program are parsed by other parts of the program. I thought it was really interesting that it gave me a better sense of what the character of the Doom engine was. I think compared to any other game engine that exists, you really get a sense of how it's all these sort of interlocking systems, and how it's the decision to have strong backwards compatibility with old versions of Doom to, to incorporate legacy features to build on top of those features. And by having to learn how to do something like this, you get a better sense of what the Doom engine is and how it works, just kind of what the feel of this kind of, indeterminate feel of the Doom engine. I thought that was really cool and exciting. And that's what I think was interesting to me about this project and about programming in general. I get why folks enjoy this. I get why people enjoy programming. I like tinkering with these things. I like having to poke and prod at it and see why things work the way they do. even and especially when it gets confusing, because as I learned that day, it took me the larger part of an afternoon and an evening just to make my computer scream at me. Thanks for having me.